It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. From London, we're joined by Nico Hines, world editor of The Daily Beast, or should I say sunny London.
It's rare, isn't it? And we're enjoying every ray.
It's a newsworthy item. Also with us, Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. How are you?
Very good.
Nice to see you.
Here.
Nice to see you as well. Pierre Aski, international affairs columnist for flagship public radio station France Inter.
Hello.
And we won't call it sunny Rome. Is it rainy Rome? France 24 correspondent Seema Gupta?
Well, it has been raining a fair bit, but the sun's out just in time for this program.
Good.
So we're quite happy about that.
Okay. And we're happy to have you. The World This Week on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag World This Week. Will it be remembered as 100 days that changed the world? Joe Biden becoming much more than the first U.S. president to address Congress with two women sitting behind him, the vice president and the House of Representatives Speaker. 40 years after Ronald Reagan declared government is the problem, Joe Biden has now called for massive spending on infrastructure, green energy, care for the elderly, and the first 2 years free for community college.
I've heard it 1,000 times. Joe, any country that out-educates us is going to outcompete us. 12 years is no longer enough today to compete with the rest of the world in the 21st century. That's why my American Families Plan guarantees 4 additional years of public education for every person in America, starting as early as we can.
Interesting, Vivian Wall. He makes it about competing with the rest of the world.
I mean, here is a politician. I think he's been quite a surprise to a lot of people. He's turned out to be way more progressive than anyone expected. But he's also so unbelievably experienced at this. This is what he has spent his life doing. And he knows how to work, you know, the powers of the legislature.
It's infused with ideology, but he makes it sound folksy and down to earth.
Absolutely. And he's also, I think, you know, avoiding certain red lines that he knows is going to just cause problems for him. For example, gun control. But in pushing through certain progressive ideas, family programs, free kindergartens, things like that, things that sitting in Europe, everybody takes for granted, and which Americans have wanted, according to the polls, for many years and have not gotten.
So he's playing catch-up?
He's playing an enormous catch-up. I mean, I think this has been a really consequential few months. If you think about where we were a few months ago under Donald Trump, it's quite remarkable how far it's moved. Of course, he has to hope that the Senate remains in Democratic hands, or he will be in real trouble in 18 months' time.
Yeah, it's on knife's edge. Joe Biden's got legions of new fans, sometimes in unlikely places.
Regardez ce que fait Joe Biden aux États-Unis. C'est incroyable. Lui, il va investir 6 000 milliards d'euros en l'espace de quelques années pour relancer la consommation, pour rendre les règles gratuites, investir dans les hôpitaux, les écoles, et tout cela, il va le financer en augmentant les impôts des plus riches, du capital. Alors, j'ai l'impression qu'il a pris sa carte au Parti communiste français.
He could be a member of the Communist Party. Do you agree, Pierre Aski?
No, not really. You know, there's something a little bit ridiculous in this mirror game between the US and France at the moment, because the left in France is using Biden to criticize Macron as the president of the rich. And they say, look at Biden, is taxing the wealthiest, and Macron is refusing to do so. But even if Biden gets his reforms through, the US will be less taxed than France. So the president of the rich is still taxing a little bit more the wealthiest class than the US will be after those reforms. So in using Biden to criticize France, the communist leader and a few others are playing politics, but it shows the power of attraction that Biden has created around the world. That you know, the progressive ideas that.
Are you personally surprised?
Of course, I'm surprised, because we've been somehow, we've been contaminated by Donald Trump's Sleepy Joe slogan. You know, during the campaign, he was describing Biden, and we were all saying, you know, he's very old, it's better than Trump, but he's very old, and will he do the job, and so on. And he's done more than the job. So, as the New York Times was saying, he promised very little, and he delivered quite a lot. So that's the big surprise.
But again, Nico Hines, and we heard it in that clip at the outset, he talks about competing with the rest of the world. Where he is, like Donald Trump, is that this is still an America first kind of mind frame.
Yeah, it's quite tragic in a way that the way that he thinks it's best to sell this idea is to pretend we're in some sort of new Cold War, to try and galvanize Americans who would otherwise claim it was communism or socialism, to have a decent education for children and to spend some money from the center. But I suppose you have to give him the credit. And what you have to remember about Biden is that he's a real realpolitik. You know, if he thinks this is the best way to get it through by galvanizing people, sticking an American flag on it, then he'll say that in order to try and get it through the House and through the Senate without some of the right-wingers in his own party rebelling.
And the fact that we're talking about sums of money that on this continent we haven't dared to spend.
Yeah, the numbers are absolutely huge. It's not just in this country, in this continent. In the US, they haven't spent these sorts of scales of money. I think somebody worked out that he was even proposing to spend more than FDR. Now, that's all things that he's suggested he wants. We'll have to wait and see what he actually is able to get through the Senate before we congratulate him too much. The original bill that he got through was pretty huge, but a lot of that money was just one-off checks to families, so that doesn't really do much to change the shape of the United States economy. But if he can get through these other huge bills as well, then he really will be a genuinely game-changing president.
All right, the same week that Joe Biden was adding $1.8 trillion to the more than $4 trillion already planned for the recovery and for infrastructure, Europe's big powers submitting their homework, you might say, their recovery fund proposals to Brussels, to the Commission. A more modest $750 billion divided among the 27. Still, there was borrowing there, so that's a first. And there's definitely, you can hear it in the politicians' voices, a Joe Biden effect.
Ma nell'insieme dei programmi che oggi presento alla vostra attenzione c'è anche e soprattutto il destino del Paese. La misura di quello che sarà il suo ruolo nella comunità internazionale, la sua credibilità e reputazione come fondatore dell'Unione Europea e protagonista del mondo occidentale. Non è dunque solo una questione di reddito, lavoro, benessere, ma anche di valori civili, di sentimenti della nostra comunità nazionale, che nessun numero, nessuna tabella potranno mai rappresentare.
Interesting, Seema Gupta, to hear Mario Draghi make this an existential moment for Italy in the way that Joe Biden made it an existential moment for the United States of America.
Yes, indeed. I think he was, riding on the idea that this money that's going to be coming in this EU recovery fund post-pandemic is really something that's going to change the status here in Italy in terms of investment, similarly as what's happening in the US, investment in infrastructure, but promoting a green economy, promoting ideas of greater, mobility in the country, looking at it in terms of a green infrastructure. And I think that's a chunk of what this money is going to go towards. It's interesting that Italy is really getting the bulk of the money from this EU recovery fund and managed to meet its deadline of the 30th of April to get that plan across to the EU. And it's hoping to go forward. I think many in Europe are seeing Mario Draghi as really a kind of a savior of sorts and perhaps the expectations are a little bit too high on this man who's said to have saved the euro, and they're hoping now that he's going to save Italy with this plan. It's interesting that he welcomed Mr. Biden with that climate summit that happened earlier on in the week, basically saying that it was helpful to have Mr. Biden there, looking at a more multilateral approach as far as the world is concerned and looking towards alliances. I think the reaction is very much a reaction against the idea of the former president in charge, Mr. Donald Trump, basically heaving a sigh of relief that now it's Biden in charge, but really on the same page in terms of moving forward in helping the countries deal with the economic problems.
And just beyond the person of Mario Draghi, Italians must be pinching themselves. Remember, Seema, for all those years, we've been telling you, oh, watch out, you're going above that 3% of GDP and public deficit spending. Now it's Christmas come early?
Well, it does seem to be that way. I mean, if you compare to what it was like when there was all that financial crisis and we had another caretaker government with another technocrat, Mario Monti, coming in. And at that time, it was all about cuts and austerity. This time round, though, Mario Draghi is coming in with money and spending. So the hope is that with a country that has suffered so badly as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, having lost 120,000 lives almost now. Essentially, the idea is that the country needed it. It made its case. And now it's going to be hoping for long-standing changes, not just in terms of a green economy, but digitalization, helping the young, helping women, trying to deal with long-standing problems of the public administration system and a justice system that's so slow. So the hope is that he's really going to be the savior, I guess.
Has Joe Biden rewritten the rule book when it comes to public spending?
Well, if you want another vision of what's going on, today the Ministry of Finance in France let it be known that they are working on a new recovery plan. The first one was 100 billion euro, and it's not even implemented yet, and they're already working on the second one. So the explanation was that they don't want to have too big a gap between the US and Europe recoveries, because the US is going to go very fast and Europe is known to be a little bit slower in its recoveries.
So it is an issue of partnerships and rivalries. Rivalry between Europe and the US, rivalry with China?
Well, also rivalry within Europe. I mean, who is emerging as the big leader of Europe? You suddenly have on the scene Mario Draghi and positioning Italy as being a major power within Europe. You have, Merkel about to retire, and so I think there's obviously a rivalry between the U.S. and Europe, and and how to deal with China. But within Europe itself, I think what will come out of this pandemic is a whole reshuffling about who's been able to come out okay and who, mishandled the whole pandemic, and I think that will have quite long-lasting kind of impact about the way we see different leaders in different countries.
Yeah, who'll turn this crisis into an opportunity as the United States roars back? Growth expected, some say, as high as 7.5% for this year there. China is also reaching for the stars. An unmanned module blasting off Wednesday with pieces for Beijing's own International Space Station, an eventual rival to the one that we saw blast off, where we had astronauts, 4 of them, blasting off last week from Cape Canaveral in Florida. But the show of strength masks perhaps a decline of a different sort. The Financial Times this week reported that for the first time since Mao's Great Leap Forward of the late 50s, the population in China is set to drop to under 1.4 billion, with India estimated at 1.38 billion. China's slide to second could come soon, in fact, very soon, Pierre Haski. What are the consequences?
Well, first of all, there's some controversy about these figures because the Chinese media have denied the FT story and say that there might be some statistical error. China and figures is always a poem. But still, the tendency, the trend is that the population of China is diminishing, and that's the impact of 35 years of one-child policy. which was abandoned in 2015, but hasn't been able to turn the table on population growth because young people in China don't want to have too many children. It's too costly. Urban life is more difficult with children. You don't have the grandparents and so on. And so China is facing the situation where it's going to become old before becoming rich. That's the dilemma that China is facing. It doesn't have the infrastructure yet to face an aging population like Japan has been working on it for years. And the second consequence is obviously economic, because you're going to have, China is gambling at the moment its recovery on domestic consumption as opposed to export, which had been the driving force of the past 3 decades. And domestic consumption, if the projections are right, China's population is going to be halved by the end of this century, 730 million.
So they'll just do like the Germans. They'll have immigrants come in.
Well, that's not exactly the way the Chinese leaders are envisaging it. They're still hoping to push the population to have kids. And there's even some studies that say that after using repression to prevent families from having more than one child, now they're going to use repression to force them to have more than one child. I mean, it's the big paradox of these demographic trends. And that's a huge challenge for the Chinese leadership.
And in Italy, I know you've had an aging population for a long time, Seema Gupta. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I think it's not going to be easy to convince people when it comes to the costs. And I think that's where the challenge is in China, similarly here, to try and make it easier for people, for families to function, to get help with childcare, to get help with caring for the elderlies in their home as well, not just because there are pressures on a lot of women in these families. And it's a similar situation in Italy. And that's what part of this recovery plan is going to be looking at, helping women who have had to deal with the burden, and also helping with care for the elderly in terms of the migrants that are coming in. We'll have to see whether China really takes that model. But yes, as the other guests mentioned, they seem to deny these figures. So we don't really know. I guess it's a bit difficult to be sure what exactly is coming out in terms of the census data out of China.
All right, when we come back, we're going to be taking a look at India and the crisis which is going from bad to worse and containing this latest spike in COVID. Stay with us. You're watching The World This Week. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Nico Heinz is with us from London. Nico, we still have the cafes and restaurants closed here. Have you been to the pub?
I have, yeah. As any good British person, as soon as the pubs were open, I was straight in there for a cold one.
All right. Well, I guess we can live vicariously. Vivian Walt of Time Magazine is with us as well. Pierre Aski, international affairs columnist at
and jealous.
France Inter. Jealous. You might also be jealous of Seema Gupta, our Rome correspondent. Rome, where they opened up on Monday. Tell us, give it to us straight here, Seema. You've been to the cafe, haven't you?
Of course, I have to get my espresso in the morning and a cornetto. And it's only nice when you're actually there and you get to just take that 5-minute break.
Take that 5-minute break. And it's not just Seema Gupta and Nico Heinz, by the way, who are annoying. Dateline Milan's Navigli Canal, where cafe terraces and outdoor dining are indeed reopened.
We are the first here at the first hour.
È quello che ci mancava da un bel po' e quindi ci sentiamo...
Siamo felici.
Siamo felici e abbiamo voglia di vivere, di tornare alla normalità.
E soprattutto bersi una birra all'aperto.
So, Vivian Walt, just a word on this, because we're heard from the French president that we're going to start to reopen mid-May.
Mid-May, but we won't be inside a restaurant until mid-June.
Right.
So we have quite a long way to go, and it's going to be very slow. Kids will go back to school this week, but only half the classes. So little by little, we're learning details about how to return to normal life, and it's going to be a few months still.
It's going to be a few months still, and they haven't reopened yet, but I hear there's already a controversy with the Paris mayor saying she might tax outdoor spaces for restaurants and cafes. Because
they've opened special locations for terraces for cafes or restaurants who don't have actually a terrace, so it's been taken from the parking lots, and they've been able to install tables and chairs on parking lots in the street. And so the mayor wants to tax them for that. And there's an uproar because they say, we're already almost dead and you're just killing us.
Shouldn't it be cafes before cars? All right. It's a very different story as we begin to reopen here in Europe to what's happening over in India. It's now reported more than 300,000 new COVID cases daily for 9 days in a row, smashing another global record this Friday with 386,000 cases in many states like Uttar Pradesh. Scenes like at this hospital in Sitapur, where this woman and her relatives are begging for oxygen for a loved one. Sometimes they have to go out looking for it for themselves. Citizens in the New Delhi suburb of Ghaziabad desperately pleading as they are outside an oxygen refilling plant.
हमने कहा थोड़ी देर के लिए दे दीजिए यहाँ इनके डॉक्टर के पास खड़ा सिलेंडर रखा हुआ है क्या इसको मैं नहीं दे सकता मैंने कहा थोड़ी देर के लिए दे दीजिए हमारा मरीज सांस लेने लगे अभी आपके सामने आ रहा है लखनऊ से सिलेंडर कार से अकेले एक सिलेंडर लेके आ रहा है
It's reached a point where crisis is a very mild word for it. It cannot be left to the citizens to run around to find a bed. They are dying on the way to the hospitals because they are going from hospital to hospital trying to find a bed. That's no way to treat our citizens. That is no way.
Since we talked about it a week ago, Nico Heinz, this scramble for oxygen has gone from bad to worse.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the scale of this problem which is mind-blowing. The estimates are that something like, you mentioned 300,000 new people testing positive each day, but estimates suggest it might be as many as 13 million people getting infected each day, which people are kind of extrapolating out to mean basically the equivalent of the entire population of France might be suffering from COVID right now in India. And when you think about numbers like that, something like 60 million people with it, you can see why there's such a strain on the system. And the fact is that the Indians were not prepared. They should have been getting ready for a huge second wave, and instead they declared victory, and Modi has just been completely missing in action. There was a petition letter published today by Indian scientists begging the Prime Minister to publish the real data on COVID. They're not releasing information about the variants, they're not releasing information about how many people have it in each state, and as a result, not only can the hospitals not prepare properly, but there's no way for the scientists to figure out where there's likely to be another surge. So, as in common with people like Bolsonaro in Brazil who are not releasing real figures, that in itself hampers the rescue operation. And it's no surprise that it's those countries that have these crazy leaders, Brazil and India, where the outbreak has been at its worst.
And there's a new war over statistics that's brewing. Several states in India say they've run out of vaccine. We can show you images from an inoculation center in Mumbai that's says it's going to be closed for 3 days. In Delhi, the chief minister told people not to show up Saturday for their jabs. Yet, the National Health Ministry claims states had 10 million vaccines stockpiled and 2 million more coming the next 3 days. Seema Gupta, this battle that's brewing between opposition, states that are governed by the opposition, and the federal government, which is BJP, this is coming on top of it all.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's very clear that, there is a political element to a lot of this. I mean, let's not forget, a lot of people have looked at this situation and wondered, well, part of the reason why this happened is because the central government allowed for that religious festival, the Kumbh Mela, to take place, and you had millions of people gathering there, no social distancing, no mask. Obviously, that was impossible. On top of that, you also had election rallies, which Prime Minister Modi himself attended. So clearly, it didn't help that there were elections and politics happening while this situation was actually brewing, which they should have known could lead to the situation that they're in right now. It's positively heartbreaking to imagine that I was receiving text messages and concern from people in India back when Italy was in the eye of the storm last year in March, and now it's happening the other way around. Positively heartbreaking.
Vivian Walt, your thoughts on this? I mean, it's
you know, what's so interesting is, and this is what the WHO has been telling us for months, that we are not safe unless everybody is safe. And here you have the world's, possibly the world's most populous country already, within a kind of explosion of cases, and among a population that's totally mobile, where you have millions of people who go back and forth, who are working in other countries and going home. I think it's not that hard to imagine that very soon there will be just another huge wave of COVID, since we have, you know, just we do not stop this virus at the borders of India. It's impossible, and I think this is a lesson that, even leaving aside what the Prime Minister Modi, all the missteps and bad decisions that have been made by the Indian government, even leaving aside, we haven't really learned the lesson of trying to protect the entire world against the virus.
And India was a major cog in that wheel.
Absolutely. A huge cog. There are Indians in every corner of the world, and I think this, this is really very, very worrying.
So in the last week, we've seen, Pierre Haski, these images of Western governments, sending oxygen on planes, France, United States, even neighboring Pakistan doing it, often a rival with India. But beyond that, how do we get to the point that Viv is talking about, where we have a global approach now to stopping this pandemic?
I think we've failed right from the beginning to have it, because the whole issue of the pandemic was politicized right from the beginning. You know, the WHO, the China-US conflict over the China virus, as Donald Trump was calling it, and it has been impossible to get a collective understanding of what was needed. And then you have the different governments' behavior, which it has been a real problem, because it's true that in Europe or in the US there's been a lot of shortcomings, of errors, of bad management that has produced a lot of disaster. But what we're witnessing in India is the disaster scenario that everybody was fearing, and that had not happened until now, since the pandemic started over a year ago. And it is happening now. And I'm not sure we are able to draw the lessons, whether it's in collective response to those disasters or in building the health services that will prevent future disasters. And the world seems to be totally incapable of getting together when we're fighting a same enemy. And that's really very disappointing, I must say, on our world and our times.
All right, and we'll see how it develops, especially now with the vaccination drive increasing here in Europe. Now, before we go, we try to keep on the news on this side of the channel. So how did we miss the significance of the April issue of Tatler magazine? In its lead story on Boris Johnson's partner, Carrie Symonds, described as putting her stamp on the living quarters of number 10 Downing Street, quote, much improved from what a visitor called the John Lewis furniture nightmare of the Theresa May years. Nico Hines, can you remind our viewers, what is the John Lewis furniture nightmare? What's John Lewis?
John Lewis is a department store, but more than that, it's the backbone of Middle England. It's a kind of, it stocks everything you need. It's very popular for people's wedding lists, and it's the sort of place where you can buy all your kitchenware and your sofas and furniture for the living room and your clothes. But the key to John Lewis is that it's respected by absolutely everybody. It's like the kind of aspirational dream of what everyone wishes they could have. And the reason that this line has become so damaging, and that Boris Johnson's partner is now being referred to in the British press as Carrie Antoinette, is because everyone else aspires to having that in their home, and these people apparently think that it's not good enough for them. And that has really cut through with the British public, because everybody here just thinks, well, why can't you make do with that? If it was good enough for previous prime ministers, if it's good enough for everyone else in the country, why do you have to lie and cover up and potentially commit illegal acts in order to bring in gaudy gold wallpaper and several £1,000 settees for your living room? It's just another example of how out of touch Boris Johnson has become. And
wait. Just a second here. Nico, just a second here. In fairness to the Prime Minister, the John Lewis furniture nightmare quote is not attributed to him or his partner. It's attributed to a visitor, an unnamed visitor.
Yeah, well, I think we all know that this is the attitude. Michael Gove, who's one of Boris Johnson's closest allies, his wife was on the radio to try and defend them this week, and she said that a Prime Minister couldn't be expected to live in a skip. And I think most people would take issue with that. Although if you look at Boris Johnson's car, which was snapped by the newspapers about a year or so ago, that looked like a skip. It was full of smeared old pots of dip and cheese crackers and dirty old newspapers and receipts. And if you take one look at him and his dishevelled appearance, you know, it's very obvious that this is not a man who's accustomed to looking his best. So I don't know why he couldn't put up with perfectly acceptable furniture.
All right. Beyond the formal inquiry launched into whether Conservative Party donors paid for that refurbishment of the Prime Minister's residence without being declared, still that burning question looms.
Is the refurbishment really that good? What does it look like? Tell the nation. What's wrong with John Lewis?
Absolutely nothing. If there's one thing I object to in this whole farrago of nonsense, is to have anything. I love John Lewis, but what I will say is that I think that
what do you love about John Lewis?
I think that what people want this government to do is focus on their priorities.
He says the words farrago of nonsense, and it makes you smile, Vivian Walt, the way that once Jacques Chirac, the French president, was in a lot of trouble over cash for going on vacation, and he said that, it went pshit, and everybody laughed, and that was the end of the scandal. Does saying farrago make this go away?
Well, can I first say that I really have to take my hat off to the Brits for always keeping us entertained, no matter what is going on. But
I thought you were going to say for keeping their politicians honest.
Exactly. But, this really reminds me of, Donald Trump saying that paying taxes was only for the little guy. Every leader recently appears to have made some kind of remark like that. President Macron saying, you can cross the street and find yourself a job. And it's just amazing to me that people in this age of social media and hot mics and cameras everywhere, that leaders continually sort of put their foot in it.
And Seema Gupta, we have a former prime minister right now who's in trouble for doing a little too much lobbying for a private firm, David Cameron, and now this is happening. You had the MPs for Expenses scandal in the UK. How do you explain the fact that, whoever paid for these refurbishments, because that is the central issue after all, it wasn't declared?
I think the feeling that maybe some people might have is that perhaps Boris Johnson should have known better. Especially if he has indeed paid up the funds now. But what was happening in the beginning? Did this money actually come from donations? I think it's interesting to look at even a country like the Vatican or an organization like the Vatican. Just earlier this week, the Pope released a new motu proprio, which is essentially a law saying now that no one hired in the Vatican, this includes cardinals and so on, can take a gift from their patrons, nothing more than 40 euros, and asking for them to declare all their assets. And this is all to respond to various scandals that have taken place in the past. Back in 2017, a former head of a Vatican hospital was convicted for stealing stealing money from a foundation in order to pay for the renovations of an apartment of a cardinal. So it's not something that only just happens in the UK, but clearly the feeling at the Vatican was that things needed to be done. And I think in the UK, they are doing the necessary checks to make sure to see and to get to the bottom of this. But I think many feel perhaps Mr. Johnson should have known better.
Pierre Aski, so there you have it. You have in the UK the refurbishment of the Prime Minister's living quarters creating a scandal that's going to be looked into by commission. The Vatican, where they're trying to be more transparent or forced to be more transparent, depending on how you look at it. What does this tell you about today's world, and can we expect the same kind of thing leading up to, there's a presidential election in this country coming up? So do you
Well, it's strange because we were joking earlier about the pubs having reopened in London, and it should be Boris Johnson moment of glory. The country getting back on its feet after such a long time and having had a successful vaccination campaign. And then he has so many scandals on his plate at the moment. And I think we're facing a kind of Trumpian moment. There's been a lot of red lines that have been crossed all over the world, to be honest, about truth, about honesty, about speaking to one thing and doing another one. And I think that's, the US have had their moment of reckoning with the election, and we've been talking about how Joe Biden is trying to show another way of governing. And here we have a leftover, in a way, of the Trump era, with these complicated relations to truth, to honesty. And I think we're going to live with that for a moment.
The opposition, Nico Hines, milking this for all it's worth. What with Keir Starmer having himself photographed at a John Lewis department store a couple of days ago. Is Boris Johnson in trouble, though?
No, I mean, I think what we need to realise is that people in Britain already think Boris Johnson is a liar and that he shouldn't be trusted. But they still think he's probably like a better Prime Minister than the Labour Party offering. At the moment, that's Keir Starmer, and I think that Keir Starmer is making ground slowly, and he has deliberately decided to kind of play the long game here. He knows that Boris Johnson, at a time of crisis, people are going to rally around it. Brexit's happened, and there's this huge pandemic, and so inevitably people are going to feel fondly or rally around the Prime Minister. He knows that the next election is not due for like 3 years, so he can slowly build his way up. But one thing that the British realise is that Boris Johnson is not straight with them. That doesn't mean to say that they think that is a reason that he can't be the Prime Minister as well.
All right, and one final word on this. Of course, it's the 21st century. So John Lewis milking the free publicity for all it's worth, bragging on social media about how it recycles pre-loved furniture, as it puts in this tweet. So yeah, there's even scandals. There's a bit of commercial buck in them these days, Vivian Walt.
Yeah, absolutely, and good for them too. I mean, they really were right on it, and parking, with their truck parked outside 10 Downing Street, it was just perfect.
Okay. We'll leave it there for now. We'll see how Boris Johnson fares until next time. Vivian Walt, I want to thank you. I want to thank as well Pierre Aski, Nico Hines in London, Seema Gupta in Rome. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.